The heat of the afternoon was a physical weight. It pressed down on Providence Creek, a town that seemed to be held together by little more than mean-spiritedness and suffocating red dust. The humidity was a sticky film on the skin, and the sun was a white, merciless eye in the sky. Even the buildings looked defeated, peeling paint on the general store, a saloon door hanging by one hinge, and the courthouse itself, a squat gray building whose steps were worn into shallow bowls by the feet of indifferent justice. Today, that justice was on full display. The courthouse square, if one could call the patch of sun-scorched earth a square, was more crowded than usual. This was not a crowd for a hanging that would come later in the week. This was a crowd for sport, for business. Men in sweat-stained linen and calloused farmers stood in clusters, their voices a low, greedy murmur. They spat tobacco juice into the dust, the sound a wet thwack that punctuated their cruel, casual laughter. At the edges, women in high-necked blouses stood with a feigned delicacy, fanning themselves slowly, their eyes missing nothing. They were silent participants in the town's sickness, their stillness a quiet, unholy amen. At the center of it all, on the courthouse steps, stood Sheriff Blevins. He was a portly man, his belly straining against the buttons of his damp shirt. A tin badge, catching the blinding sunlight, was pinned crookedly to his suspenders. He was not just an officer of the law. He was a showman, and this was his stage. "All right, folks, settle down, he boomed, his voice carrying the greasy authority of a carnival barker. Beside him, chained at the wrists to a thick iron ring on the wall, stood a man. He was tall, with a frame that spoke of strength, though it was now gaunt from starvation. His clothes were little more than rags, torn and caked with that same red dust. Rusted shackles had carved raw, bloody grooves into his flesh. But he was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at the sheriff. He held his head high, his dark eyes fixed on some point in the far distance, a point beyond the peeling paint and the hate-filled faces. His very stillness, his refusal to beg or to break, seemed to enrage the crowd more than any protest could have.
"Now," Sheriff Blevins continued, hooking his thumbs in his suspenders, "what we have here is a vagrant, picked up 2 nights ago with no papers, no money, and no good reason for being in our fine county." "Liar!" a voice called from the crowd, followed by a ripple of laughter. "It don't matter what he is," Blevins said, quieting them with a raised hand. "What matters is the law, and the law says vagrancy carries a fine of $25. And since this boy can't pay, the law says his labor is to be leased to the highest bidder for a term of 6 months to cover his debt to the county." Blevins walked over and grabbed the man's chin, forcing his head to the side. "Look at this! A strong back, good teeth. He'll work your fields, clear your stumps, and he won't give you no trouble, because if he does, you just bring him right back to me." The man, Elias, said nothing. He simply met the sheriff's gaze until Blevins, unsettled, let go and wiped his hand on his pants. "All right, let's start the bidding," Blevins shouted. "Who'll give me $10 for 6 months of prime labor?" "10," shouted a thin-faced man near the front. "I'll give 12," called another, "but I'll work that stubbornness out of him 'fore the first week is out." At the very back of the crowd, Clara Whitford felt the bile rise in her throat. She had only come to town for flour, an act she now deeply regretted. She was the widow Whitford, a woman the town pitied when they bothered to remember her at all. Her ranch was failing, her hands were calloused, and her heart, she thought, had been buried 3 years prior to her husband, Jacob. She clutched her empty basket, the meager coins in her pocket feeling as heavy as lead. She watched the scene, her knuckles white. She saw the men, their eyes glittering. She saw the women, their faces cold and blank. She saw the sheriff, a pig fattening himself on the misery of others. And then she saw him. She saw the man in chains. She saw the raw wounds, the defiant set of his jaw. She saw him for one brief second close his eyes as if to find a place inside himself where they could not reach. 15! 17! $17, Blevins grinned. A bargain, gentlemen. A prime piece of property for $17. Going once? Going twice? Clara hadn't realized she was moving. Her feet, clumsy in her worn boots, carried her through the parting crowd. A path cleared for her, not out of respect, but out of sheer, stunned confusion. The widow Whitford? What was she doing? Sold to Mr. Abernathy for... Don't harm him.
Clara's voice, rough from disuse, was clear and sharp as a rifle crack. It sliced through the humid air, and the entire square went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sheriff Blevins' grin froze, then curdled. Mrs. Whitford? Clara stepped forward, her body trembling so hard she thought her legs might give way. But she kept walking until she stood at the base of the steps, looking up at the sheriff. I said don't harm him, she repeated, her voice stronger now. I'll pay his price. The silence that followed was absolute. Then it broke like a dam of filth. A woman gasped. A man let out a short, barking laugh. Has she lost her mind? What's a lone woman want with that? It's an abomination. Sheriff Blevins held up a hand, his face a mask of patronizing amusement. Now, Mrs. Whitford, this ain't a stray dog you're rescuing. This here is official county business. This thing is a dangerous criminal. He's a man, she shot back, her voice shaking with a cold fury that surprised even her. She looked past the sheriff, at Elias. For the first time, his eyes moved. He looked down at her. He saw her faded dress, her trembling hands, her blazing, terrified eyes. He saw her. Clara turned back to the sheriff and to the sea of hateful faces watching her. Call him property all you want, sheriff. Call him whatever vile name suits your small, cruel hearts. I look at him and I see a man worth saving. Blevins' face flushed a deep, ugly purple. He was no longer amused. That's $25, Mrs. Whitford. The full fine. Not 17, 25. I expect that's more than you've seen in a month. He had her. He knew it. The whole town knew it. That was her seed money, her food, her survival. Without a word, Clara reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her worn leather purse. With shaking fingers, she unfastened the clasp and poured its entire contents into her hand. A few folded bills and a small handful of coins. She counted it out, her humiliation a hot brand on her face. 22, 23, 24, and with a few pennies and dimes, 25. She held the money out to Blevins. He stared at it, then at her, his eyes filled with contempt. He snatched the money from her palm. Fine, he's your problem now. He turned and with a disgusted grunt produced a key. He unlocked the shackles. The rusted iron fell to the steps with a dull, heavy clang that echoed across the silent square. Get on, then, Blevins spat at Elias. He stood. He rubbed his raw, bleeding wrists. He did not look at Blevins. He did not look at the crowd. He walked down the steps, his dignity a shield, and stopped a few feet behind Clara. Clara turned, her face pale, and began to walk. The crowd parted for them, a sea of hatred that recoiled from her as if she, too, were diseased. The whispers followed them, a swarm of angry hornets. Scandal. Ruined herself. What would her husband say? Traitor. Clara kept her chin high. She did not look at them. She did not look back. She just walked, her empty basket hanging from her arm. Elias followed, his steps measured and silent. Two solitary figures,
walking out of the dusty, sick-hearted town. The long, silent walk to the ranch was just beginning, and a new, terrifying chapter of their lives had just been violently torn open.
The walk from town was a mile, but it felt like 100. It was a journey made in a suffocating, shared silence. Clara walked in the lead, her back rigid, the empty basket banging softly against her hip with each step. She could hear his footsteps behind her, not the shuffling of a broken man, but the measured, heavy tread of someone. She didn't dare look back. What had she done? The words of the townspeople were a hornet's nest buzzing in her head. Abomination. Traitor. Crazy woman. She had spent every last cent. She had bought a man. A man whose name she didn't even know. A man who now walked behind her, a towering, silent shadow in the oppressive afternoon heat. Her shame from the town square was now curdling into a new, hotter shame. She was leading him to this. They crested the final hill, and the ranch came into view. It wasn't a ranch. It was a skeleton. The wind, which had been a low whistle, now seemed to mourn as it passed through the slats of the barn. The main house itself, once white, was now the color of old bones, its paint peeled away by 3 winters of neglect and grief. It listed, just slightly to the east, as if it had given up the fight to stand straight. The front porch sagged. The garden was a choked mass of dead thistles. And the fence was a row of broken teeth. This was not a home. It was a testament to failure. It was Jacob's dream, rotting back into the earth. Clara stopped, her courage failing her. This was her despair, laid bare for a stranger to see. She finally turned to look at him. His eyes were not on her. They were on the ranch. He was observing, his gaze moving slowly from the broken rain gutter, to the sagging barn door, to the rusted, overturned plow near the path. He was reading the land, reading her failure. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't pitying. He was just taking it in. "It's not much," Clara said, her voice small, hating the apology in it. It fell into disrepair. After my husband passed." The man said nothing. He simply met her gaze, and she saw, for the first time, the sheer, fathomless exhaustion in his eyes. "The barn," she said, gesturing, desperate to fill the silence. "You can sleep in the loft. It sits dry. I'll bring some blankets. And water." She led the way, not to the house, that felt too intimate, a line she wasn't ready to cross, but to the barn. The great doors groaned as she forced one open, the sound like a creature in pain. The air inside was thick with the smell of old hay and dust. Light streamed in through the gaps in the walls. She pointed to the ladder. "The loft is up there. I'll get the water." She fled. She ran to the well, her hands shaking as she worked the pump. She drew a bucket of cool, clear water and carried it back, her heart hammering. She found him standing exactly where she had left him, a pillar of stillness in the dusty light. He took the bucket, his movements economical and deliberate. He nodded once. "The blankets," she stammered. "I'll be back." She hurried to the house, the sound of the locking bar sliding into place behind her feeling both foolish and necessary. The house was a tomb. It was her tomb. She leaned against the door, her eyes shut tight. "What have I done? What have I done?" She pulled 2 old, heavy wool blankets from Jacob's trunk. They were clean, she had kept that much, at least. She took them to the barn, but paused at the door, her nerve failing. She left them folded on a bale of hay near the entrance. "The blankets are here," she called out, and then she fled again, locking herself inside the fading, empty house as the sun began to bleed crimson across the horizon. Night fell. Clara sat at her kitchen table in the dark, the house so quiet it felt like she was screaming. She hadn't lit a lamp. She hadn't eaten. She thought of the town. She thought of Sheriff Blevins. She thought of the man in her barn. She thought of the money she'd spent. She was ruined. Utterly ruined. But then, a new thought pricked at her. He hasn't eaten either. It was a simple, animal fact. She had taken responsibility for him. She lit the lamp, the small flame pushing back the shadows. With mechanical movements, she went to the stove. The larder was almost bare. She made what she had, a small pot of beans, left over from the day before, and a single, dry piece of cornbread. It was a plate of despair. Her hands trembled as she carried the plate and the lantern across the dark yard. The night sounds of crickets and a distant coyote felt unnaturally loud. She was afraid. But it was not a fear of him. It was a fear of this newness. This terrible, unknown thing she had set in motion. She pushed open the barn door. I brought you some. She stopped. In the sliver of moonlight filtering through the warped boards, he was not in the loft. He was sitting on the hay bale where she'd left the blankets. And he was working. He had found a piece of old, broken leather harness in the corner. In his hands, which she now saw were not just strong but skilled, he was methodically mending a broken buckle. He was using a small piece of wire he must have found, his fingers working with a precision and grace that was mesmerizing. He was not a vagrant. He was not property. He was a craftsman. He stopped his work when he saw her, his hands falling still. Clara, stunned into silence, simply walked forward and held out the plate of food. He looked at the meager offering. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the trembling lantern light. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the plate. He held it for a moment. Then his lips parted, and a voice, deep and rusty from disuse, broke the silence of the night. "Thank you?" It was just 2 words. But it shattered the spell. It was not the growl of a brute, or the plea of a victim. It was the voice of a man. A man who had just been paid for. A man who sat in the dark, mending what was broken. Clara simply nodded, unable to speak, and retreated from the barn, leaving him with the lantern. She went back to the house. She slid the lock bar into place, but it felt different now. She sat on her bed, in the house that was her husband's tomb. She could hear the town's voices in her head, warning her. A woman alone, with a savage, he'll murder you in your sleep. She should have been terrified. She was not. The fear was gone. In its place, a strange, cold, and powerful purpose was settling in her bones. She was not alone on this ranch. She had spent her last dollar on a man who knew how to fix things. She lay back on her bed, staring into the darkness, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't thinking about the past. She was thinking about tomorrow. Clara awoke with a jolt, the gray morning light filtering through her dusty window. For a moment, she was adrift, convinced the day before, the auction, the walk, the man in her barn, had been a fever dream, a manifestation of her grief and loneliness. Then she heard it. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of a hammer, striking true. It was the sound of work. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons on her dress. She went to the stove, her mind racing. She did not just make coffee for herself. She poured 2 cups into tin mugs. She stepped out onto the sagging porch. The morning air was cool, but the promise of another brutal day was already present. She looked toward the broken fence line, the one that had been a row of broken teeth. Elias was there. He had already been working for an hour, or perhaps all night. He had gathered the fallen posts. He was replacing a rotted support beam, his movements economical and precise. He had his back to her, and she watched as the muscles in his back and shoulders, visible through the tatters of his shirt, contracted and released with each swing of the heavy mallet he'd found. She walked toward him, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. "I brought coffee." He stopped, the hammer resting in his grip. He turned slowly. His face was unreadable in the morning light, but he looked at the 2 cups. He looked at her. He nodded, taking the mug she offered. They stood there for a moment, a strange tableau. The widow and the vagrant, drinking coffee as the sun rose over a dying ranch. A fragile, unspoken truce had been forged in the pre-dawn light. And then, the sound of hoofbeats shattered it. Not 1 horse. 2. Coming fast. Clara's blood went cold. She looked toward the road. Elias did not look. His eyes scanned the tree line, a flicker of something old and hunted passing over his features. He set his mug down on a fence post, but he kept the hammer in his hand. The riders crested the hill. It was not the sheriff. It was, perhaps, worse. Dale Morrison, mounted on a fine black mare that was worth more than her entire property, reined in at her gate. Beside him, on a mean-looking pinto, was his foreman, a man named Hutch, whose face looked like it had been carved from a piece of sourwood. Morrison didn't wait for an invitation. He unlatched her gate and rode his horse right into her yard, stopping just feet from the porch, trampling what was left of her mother's rose bushes. Hutch stayed back, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Clara, Clara, Clara," Dale Morrison said, his voice a thick syrup of false concern. He tipped his expensive hat. "A man can't help but worry." "I'm fine, Dale," Clara said, her voice tight. She despised this man. Despised his false kindness, his greedy eyes that stripped her land bare every time he looked at it. Morrison's gaze slid past her, over to the fence line. He saw Elias. His feigned smile vanished, replaced by a look of unveiled disgust. "So, the rumors are true," Morrison said, his voice losing its polite edge. He looked at Elias, then back at Clara. "I heard you'd lost your senses, Clara. I didn't think you'd lost them this badly." He gestured with his riding crop. "This place is too much for you. I've told you that. A lone woman can't manage. And now you're bringing in stray property? You'll get us all killed." "He is not property," Clara said, her hands balling into fists. Morrison laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. "It doesn't matter what you call it, Clara. It's a problem. And I'm here to solve it." He swung his leg over his horse, dismounting with the easy confidence of a man who owned everything he saw. He walked slowly toward her, his spurs jingling in the dirt. Hutch dismounted too, leaning against the mare, a silent threat. "I'm a reasonable man," Morrison said, stopping at the base of her porch. He was too close. "I'll make you my last offer. I'll take this wreck off your hands. Cash. Enough for a ticket back east, where you belong. You sign the deed, and I'll even deal with your new hired hand. No one has to know. I'll have the sheriff handle it, quiet like." The threat hung in the air, vile and unmistakable. He was offering to make Elias disappear. "My land," Clara said, her voice trembling, "is not for sale." Morrison's face darkened. The mask of the concerned neighbor was gone. "Now you listen to me, you foolish woman," he snarled, and he took a step up onto her porch. He was in her space now, looming over her. "You don't have a choice. You are a disgrace to this county. You are harboring a thing that decent folk want gone. Now you will sell to me, or I promise you this town will." He never finished the sentence. A shadow fell over him. Elias had moved. He had made no sound. Not a single footfall in the dirt. But he was no longer at the fence. He was at the base of the porch, standing just behind and to the side of Clara. He was not looking at Morrison. He was looking at Hutch. The hammer was still in his right hand, held loosely at his side. It was just a tool. But it was a heavy tool. And the man holding it, still and silent as a mountain, was a clear and present danger. Hutch's hand, which had been resting on his pistol, was now gripping it. Morrison stopped. He turned slowly. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the quiet, solid strength, the hammer, and the eyes that held no fear. Morrison let out a small, contemptuous huff. But he took a step back off the porch. Clara had been frozen, her breath caught in her chest. But the presence of Elias beside her, solid, real, and with her, was like a steel rod being fused to her spine. She felt his strength, and it ignited her own. She looked Dale Morrison square in the face. The tremor was gone from her voice. "I said," she repeated, her voice low and cold as well water, "get off my property." Morrison stared at her, stunned by the change. He looked from her cold, furious eyes to the silent, watchful man beside her. The calculation was visible on his face. This was not the broken widow he had come to bully. He had been checkmated. For now. He backed away, moving to his horse. "You're making a mistake, Clara," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "A mistake the whole county won't let you forget. When this thing shows its true colors, and it will, don't you come crying to me for help." "I won't," Clara said. Morrison mounted his horse, yanked the reins, and galloped away, Hutch following close behind, leaving a cloud of red dust and hate in his wake. Clara stood on the porch, shaking, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak-kneed. Elias did not move. He waited until the riders were just specks on the horizon. Then he turned. He looked at Clara, then at the hammer in his hand. He set it down on the porch step. He looked at her one last time, a long, assessing gaze. Then he turned, picked up his tin mug of cold coffee, and walked back to the fence to continue his work. The cloud of dust from Morrison's retreat settled, but the air remained thick. The confrontation, brutal and sudden, had drawn a line in the dirt that could not be undrawn. Clara stood on the porch, her hands still clutching the rail, watching Elias work. The sound of the hammer, which had woken her that morning, now felt different. It was no longer just the sound of work. It was the sound of defiance. It was the sound of "we are still here." She let out a long, shuddering breath and walked down the steps. She approached him as he set a new post. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quiet. Elias didn't look up. He focused on tamping the dirt around the base of the post. "He was on your porch, ma'am. He would have..." Clara stopped, unable to voice the threat. "He's dangerous, Elias. He wants this land. He won't stop." "Then we won't stop," Elias said simply. He tested the post. It was solid. Clara looked at the long, perfect line of new fence he had already built. The broken teeth were gone, replaced by a straight, strong barrier. It was the first new, whole thing on the ranch in 3 years. "This," she said, gesturing to the fence, her throat tight. "The work. I can't pay you. I told you, I spent everything I had." She felt the hot sting of shame again. "I can't pay you for any of this." Elias finally stopped. He turned to face her. His clothes were still rags, and his face was streaked with sweat and red dust, but his eyes were clear. "You already did." The words hung in the quiet morning air. Clara stared at him, the full weight of his meaning landing on her. She hadn't bought his labor. She had paid his fine. She had bought his freedom. And in his eyes that was a debt that was settled, a debt that had nothing to do with money. He turned back to his work. "I'd like to stay. I'd like to work this land. Not for that." He gestured toward town. "For this. For the ranch. I have nothing to offer," she whispered, her honesty a painful admission. "Food. The roof in the barn. That's all." Elias picked up his hammer. "That is enough." And with that, the agreement was made. It was not a contract of employment. It was a partnership of survivors. The days that followed were a revelation. The ranch, which had been groaning under the weight of Clara's grief, began to change. The sound of despair was replaced by the sounds of repair. Elias was not just strong, he was skilled. His hands, Clara realized, were not the calloused, rough hands of a simple field laborer. They were the hands of a craftsman. They were hands that knew. He moved from the fence to the well pump. It had been broken for a year, its iron handle frozen with rust, forcing Clara to haul water in buckets from the creek. She had watched Jacob fight with it, curse it, and finally abandon it. Elias took it apart. Piece by piece. He laid the rusted components out on an old blanket. He cleaned them, filed them, used oil from the barn to work the mechanisms free. He worked for an entire day, his focus absolute. And then, Clara heard a sound she thought she'd never hear again, the rhythmic, metallic creak, squeak, creak, squeak, followed by the glorious, liquid gush of clear, cold water pouring into the trough. She ran out, and he simply nodded at her, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He mended the sagging porch, replacing the rotted boards. He rehung the barn door so it no longer dragged in the dirt. He moved with a quiet, efficient confidence that astounded her. One afternoon, she found him on the roof of the barn, patching the great hole that had let in the rain and snow for 2 winters. He had salvaged shingles from a collapsed shed, and he was laying them in a neat, perfect line. She stood at the base of the ladder, watching him. "Where did you learn to do this?" she called up. He stopped, hammer in hand, and looked down at her. "I was a carpenter," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "Before the war. I had my own shop. In Tennessee." He said nothing more, but the "before" hung in the air, a word that held a universe of unspoken loss. A carpenter. A man with a trade, a shop, a life. Stolen from him, first by the war, and then by the petty, cruel laws of a town like Providence Creek. That night, something changed in Clara. For weeks, the routine had been the same. She would cook, and she would carry a plate out to the barn. But tonight she stood in her kitchen, the plate in her hand, and she just stopped. She looked at the small, lonely table where she had eaten every meal alone for 3 years. The table Jacob had built. She put the plate down. She took out a second one. She set the table for 2. She went to the door and stepped onto the porch. He was washing his hands at the newly fixed pump, the setting sun catching the water as it ran over his arms. "Elias!" she called out. He looked up, surprised. "Supper's on the table," she said, her voice unsteady. "Inside." He paused, his hands dripping. He was drying them on his shirt as he walked to the house, his movements hesitant. He stopped at the threshold, his tall frame filling the doorway. Entering the house was a different line, one he had not crossed. "Ma'am? You'll eat at the table," Clara said. It was not a request. He slowly stepped inside, ducking his head. He looked at the table, set for 2. He sat, his movements stiff, as she placed the food between them. They ate in silence for a long time. But it was not the tense, suffocating silence of their first day. It was the quiet of 2 tired people, sharing a meal after a long day's work. The sound of their forks on the plates was the only sound. Finally, Clara looked out the kitchen window, at the new fence line, at the barn that no longer listed. It's starting to look like a home again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought that was gone. I thought it was all just gone." Elias finished chewing. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the table. Hands that were calloused and stained, but that knew how to build. He looked out the window, not at the buildings, but at the land itself, dark and fallow in the twilight. "This land is tired, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and soft. "But it ain't dead." He turned his gaze to her, and his eyes were not just observant, they were kind. "It's just been grieving. Same as you." Clara's breath hitched. A single tear, the first she had shed in months, escaped and rolled down her cheek. He saw it all. He saw the land, he saw her, he saw the grief that bound them both. "It's just waiting," Elias continued, his voice a low comfort in the dimming light. "Waiting for hands that know." Clara looked at him, this man she had bought, this stranger who had seen the truth of her in a way no one else had. She, the savior, was being seen. She was being understood. She nodded, wiping the tear away with the back of her hand. They were no longer the widow and the vagrant. They were no longer the rescuer and the rescued. They were just 2 people, at a table, in a house that was no longer a tomb. They were partners. And the ranch, and their broken lives, were finally in the hands of someone who knew how to rebuild. The partnership, forged over the well pump and the fence line, now settled into a domestic rhythm. The evenings became a ritual. They ate together at the kitchen table, Jacob's table. The silence between them was no longer tense, or new. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, the silence of 2 people who have worked a long, hard day and found solace in the simple act of a shared meal. This night, the air was cooler, a hint of autumn on the wind. Clara washed the 2 plates in the basin while Elias stood beside her, a dry cloth in his hands, drying. It was a simple, shared task. A husband and wife task. The thought flickered in Clara's mind, and she pushed it away, her cheeks warm. She looked down at his hands as he dried the plate. They were large, calloused, and marked with small nicks and older, faded scars. But they were gentle with the porcelain. They were hands that knew how to be careful. "Elias," she said, her voice soft, not looking up from the water. You said you were a carpenter?" He paused, the cloth still in his hand. "Yes, ma'am." "You must have been very good at it. The barn roof, it's perfect. Not even Jacob could get those shingles to lie so flat." A ghost of something, perhaps a smile, or just the memory of one, touched his lips. I enjoyed the work. The smell of fresh-cut cedar. The satisfaction of a true joint." He looked at his own hands. "It's been a long time." Clara scrubbed at a non-existent spot on the plate. Her heart was beating fast. She had to ask. She had to know the man who had so quietly entered her life and begun to rebuild it. What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In Tennessee. You said before?" He went very still. The sound of the crickets outside seemed to rush in, filling the kitchen. He placed the plate he was drying on the counter with deliberate, slow care. He turned, not to look at her, but to stare out the small, dark window above the sink, at his own reflection. "Before," he said, his voice flat, "is another life." "Please," Clara said, turning to him, her hands dripping. I want to know." He was quiet for so long she thought he would refuse. When he spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, a sound from a deep, dark well of memory. "I had a wife," he began. "Sarah. She had a laugh. Lord, it was like birdsong in the morning. And we had a son. Daniel. He was 4. Just 4 years old, and already he could hammer and nail straight. Almost." He paused, swallowing. Clara's heart ached. She did not move, did not breathe. "We were freedmen," he continued, his voice hardening. "I built our house, with my own hands, near a creek. Built my shop right next to it. People, they came. They saw the work was good. They didn't all care what color the hand was that did it. We were doing well. We were saving. We were happy." He closed his eyes. That was the crime. It wasn't that we were free. It was that we were succeeding. It was that we were happy. "Elias," Clara breathed. "They came in the night," he said, his voice now a monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else, the only way he could bear to tell it. "The riders. We heard the horses, the shouting. I told Sarah to take Daniel to the root cellar to hide." He turned from the window to look at her, and his eyes were hollow. "But they didn't come for us. They came for the shop. For what I had built. They set it on fire. I ran out. I tried to stop them. There were so many. They held me. They made me watch. They thought it was funny," he whispered, a terrible, shaking rage entering his voice. "They held me, and they made me watch my work burn. And the wind was high that night. The sparks, they jumped to the house. It was so fast. The roof, it was dry. Clara brought her wet hands to her mouth, a silent scream building in her throat. "Oh God. Elias, no. The cellar." He shook his head, a single, violent motion. "The house. It went up like tinder. The cellar door, it was in the kitchen floor. They were trapped. I heard her. I heard her scream my name. Just once." He was breathing hard now, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And I was held. They laughed. They held me, And they laughed, and they watched it burn. Watched it all burn. My life. My boy. My... Sarah. Clara was weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face. She reached out, but didn't know how to touch him, how to comfort this. When they let me go, he finished, his voice dead. There was nothing left. Just embers. Nothing to bury. Nothing to be. I just walked. I walked for months. Or a year. I don't know. I didn't care. I was just a ghost. And then, Sheriff Blevins found a vagrant who looked strong enough to work. He stood there, vibrating with the horror of his own memory, exposed and broken. Clara's tears were not just for his story. They were tears of a terrible, shared understanding. She knew what it was to watch, helpless, as your world burned. I know, she whispered, her voice choked. He looked at her, his expression confused, as if pulling himself back from that night of fire. Ma'am? The fire, she said, her voice shaking. The helplessness. Knowing there is nothing you can do. Not a single thing on God's earth. She walked to the table and sank into a chair, her legs unable to hold her. Mine wasn't Ryder's. It was a fever. It was just... God, it was just a fever. She was talking to him, but she was back in that room. My Jacob. He was so strong. He built this table. He built this house for me. He was my life. And he got sick. Just a cold at first. Then the fever came. It was so fast, Elias. 3 days. She looked at her own hands, twisting in her lap. I did everything. I sat by his bed. I boiled herbs. I prayed. I bargained with God, right here in this kitchen. I told God, take the ranch. Take me. Just let him stay. Her voice broke. But the fever, it burned. I watched him just fade. He didn't know who I was at the end. And then, he was just gone. The house, it was so quiet. It's been so quiet for 3 years. She looked up at him, her eyes blurring with tears, but seeing him clearly. The town, they came. They brought pies. And they pitied me. The poor widow Wickford. I wanted to scream at them. They didn't see me. They saw a problem. Sell the ranch, they said. Go back east. You can't stay here alone. They wanted to erase me. Erase him? Elias stood, his own pain a living thing in the room, and he looked at her. He saw her. He saw her, not as the white woman who had bought him, not as ma'am, but as a fellow survivor. A person who was also, in her own way, the sole remnant of a fire. But you stayed, he said, his voice soft. I stayed, she sobbed. I was too stubborn. Or too broken. I didn't know how to leave. This was our dream. He walked to the table. He looked down at the simple, sturdy wood that Jacob had built. It's a good table, he said, a carpenter's quiet praise. That was what finally broke her. The simple, kind acknowledgement of her dead husband's work. A wave of grief, 3 years suppressed, tore through her. She put her head down on the table, on Jacob's table, and she wept. She wept for Jacob. She wept for Sarah. She wept for little Daniel. She wept for the sheer, terrible loss of it all. She was so lost in her sorrow, she didn't feel him move. But then, she felt a weight. Elias had pulled out the other chair and sat across from her. And he had reached across the table. His large, scarred carpenter's hand was resting gently on top of her small, chapped one. The touch was a shock. It was not a touch of pity. It was a touch of strength. It was the simple, profound anchor of another human being. She slowly quieted, her sobs turning to shuddering breaths. She lifted her head and looked at their hands clasped together on the table. We're a pair, aren't we? She said, her voice a wreck, a bitter, watery laugh escaping her. The widow and the vagrant. Both of us haunted. Both of us just left. Elias looked at their joined hands. He gave hers a single, firm squeeze. We're still breathing, he said, his voice a low, steady promise. The dead are dead, Clara. We're not. She met his gaze. He had called her Clara. She squeezed his hand back. No, she whispered, her first true, defiant breath in 3 years. We're not. The confession of their pasts, that terrible night of shared stories, did not just bring them closer, it fused them. The space between them, once filled with the silence of strangers, was now filled with the profound, unspoken knowledge of a shared survival. The ranch was no longer Clara's burden and Elias's refuge. It was their fortress. And they had been at peace. For a few weeks, the world was just the two of them. It was the rhythm of work. The sound of Elias's saw, the smell of Clara's baking bread, the evenings at Jacob's table, where they would plan the next day's repairs. The land, fed by hands that knew, was healing. And so were they. But Providence Creek had not forgotten them. And hatred, when it is ignored, does not die. It festers. It waits. It came on a moonless night. Clara was darning a sock by the fire. Elias was at the table, using a piece of charcoal to sketch a plan for a new chicken coop. The quiet of the house was so complete, they heard the first sound at the same time. A low rumble. Distant, at first. Like far-off thunder. Elias went still. His head lifted. What is that? Clara whispered. He didn't answer. He was listening, his body tensing, his eyes fixed on the dark window. The rumble grew, resolving itself into the unmistakable, chaotic pounding of many horses. Hoofbeats, coming fast. And with it another sound. Shouting. Not a single voice, but a guttural, drunken chorus. Clara's blood turned to ice. Elias stood, knocking his chair over. The sound of it crashing to the floor was lost in the sudden, terrible roar of men and horses exploding into their yard. Get out here, boy! We know you're in there, traitor! Time to pay your fine, vagrant! Clara ran to the window, her heart seizing. It wasn't a few men. It was a dozen. Or more. And they were masked? Ragged cloth covered their faces, turning them into a faceless, many-headed beast. And they carried torches. Angry, flickering orange light danced across the yard, washing over the porch, painting the new fence line in colors of fire and blood. There, Clara stammered, backing away from the window. Elias was not looking out the window. He was looking at the firelight. His face was a mask of cold, terrible recognition. This was his nightmare, made real. This was the fire from Tennessee, come back for him. Clara saw his expression. The hollowed-out look. The deadness. And something in her snapped. The fear vanished, replaced by a white-hot, protective fury that she had never known she possessed. They think they can burn us, she whispered, her voice a low, vicious thing. They think they can just burn us. She turned from him and strode to the fireplace. Above it, on 2 wooden pegs, rested Jacob's old, double-barreled shotgun. She had not touched it in 3 years. Her hands were steady as she lifted it down. Clara! Elias breathed, his voice pulling him back from his own ghosts. In the pantry, she said, her voice like steel. The box of shells. He didn't hesitate. He moved to the pantry. As he fumbled for the box, his eyes fell on the axe he had been using to split wood. He left the box. He grabbed the long, smooth, hickory axe handle, his grip so tight his knuckles went white. A rock shattered the kitchen window, spraying glass across the floor. Send him out, or we burn it down! A voice, slurred and familiar, Hutch, Morrison's foreman, bellowed. We'll burn you both! They won't, Clara said, her voice shaking but full of venom. She broke the shotgun, and Elias, now at her side, pressed 2 heavy shells into her hand. She slotted them into the chambers. She snapped the gun shut. The click-clack of the action was the loudest sound in the world. Stay behind me, Elias said, moving toward the door, the axe handle held low. Like hell I will, Clara said. She strode to the door, unbarred it, and threw it open. She stepped out onto the porch, into the full, flickering glare of the torches. Elias was half a step behind her, a solid, dark shadow at her shoulder. The mob went silent. They had come for a scared widow and a cowering man. They found a woman in a white nightgown, her face a mask of cold fury, leveling a shotgun at the center of the crowd. And beside her, a man with the build of an oak tree, holding an axe handle like a war club. They were not afraid. They were ready. You get that thing off this porch, Clara," Hutch stammered, his mask doing nothing to hide the sudden fear in his voice. This ain't your business. We just want the boy." Clara took one more step forward, to the edge of the porch, the firelight catching the twin black holes of the shotgun's barrels. "He," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and deadly, "is not a boy. He is Elias. And this is his home." She raised the shotgun to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel directly at Hutch's chest. "You have 10 seconds," she said, "to get your cowardly, drunken trash off my property. Before I send you to hell, and I ask God for forgiveness in the morning." A collective, nervous shuffle went through the mob. Horses stamped. Men looked at each other. This was not what they had come for. They had come for a fire. They had come for blood. They had not come to be shot. Hutch looked at the unwavering gun. He looked at Elias, who looked, in that moment, like he would enjoy nothing more than to wade into the crowd with that axe handle. "This ING." Hutch started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. "This ain't over, Clara. You hear me? Morrison's gonna have this land. One way or another. You've made your choice. Get," Clara said, her voice a low command. Hutch stared for one more second, defeated. He yanked his horse's reins. "Let's go, boys!" He wheeled his horse around, and the mob, their courage broken, dissolved with him. They galloped away, a chaotic, cowardly retreat, their shouts now just angry, impotent echoes in the dark. One man, in a final act of spite, hurled his torch toward the barn. It fell short, landing in the damp dirt of the yard, where it sputtered and died. Clara and Elias did not move. They stood, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in the sudden, ringing silence. They watched until the last flicker of torchlight had disappeared over the hill. Clara's arms began to shake. The shotgun suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. She lowered it, her knees threatening to buckle. Elias put his hand on her shoulder. A solid, steadying weight. She looked up at him. The nightmare had come, and they had faced it. They had not run. They had not hidden. They had stood. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice trembling now that the danger had passed. "Yes," Elias said, his eyes still on the dark road. "But they'll know we're waiting." He took the shotgun from her trembling hands, and together they turned and walked back into the house, their fortress, their home. The week that followed the night of the riders was not a week of peace. It was a siege. Clara and Elias worked, but their bodies were coiled, their eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. They spoke little, their partnership now a silent, shared watch. They were two people on a small island, waiting for the hateful tide to rise again. The attack had not come. But the quiet was, in its own way, louder than the threats. It was a Tuesday. A blistering, dry afternoon. Elias was on the barn roof, his hammer striking a lonely, rhythmic echo, securing the last of the new shingles. Clara was in the yard, hanging laundry, the simple domestic act of small rebellion against the hate that surrounded them. And then, she smelled it. It was not the smell of a cook fire. It was the acrid, choking smell of rage. She looked up, and her heart stopped. To the east, over the small hill that separated their land from their neighbors, a pillar of thick, greasy black smoke was climbing into the sky, swallowing the sun. "Elias!" she screamed. He was already scrambling down the ladder. He hit the ground running, his eyes fixed on the smoke. "That's the Abernathy place," Clara's mind flashed to the auction. To Mr. Abernathy, the man who had bid on Elias. The man who had sneered at her in town. Elias was already sprinting toward the hill. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the empty water bucket from the pump and ran after him. There was no thought of neighbor or enemy. There was only fire. They crested the hill, and the scene below was an image from hell. The Abernathy barn was not just on fire, it was a roaring, churning furnace. Flames licked 100 feet into the sky, and the sound of it, a deafening, hollow roar like a freight train, was terrifying. The entire community was there. But they were not fighting. They were losing. Men were running in circles, shouting. A disorganized bucket brigade from the well was doing nothing, the water turning to steam 10 feet from the inferno. Sheriff Blevins was there, his face red, yelling useless orders. Dale Morrison was there, too, sitting on his horse on a nearby hill, watching it all with a cold, assessing gaze. And then Clara saw Martha Abernathy, her dress soaked, her face black with soot. She was running back and forth, her eyes wide with animal panic. Her husband, the man from the auction, was trying to pull a screaming, terrified horse from a nearby corral. "It's no use!" Blevins shouted. "The whole thing's coming down! Get back! Get back, all of you!" Clara and Elias ran into the yard, and people stopped, even in their panic, to stare. What were they doing here? It was then that Martha Abernathy, in a sudden, sickening moment of clarity, stopped. She looked at the inferno. She looked at the small rag doll lying in the dirt near the great, burning barn doors. Her face, which had been panicked, collapsed into a mask of pure, primal horror. "Where?" she whispered. "Where is Lily?" She looked at the doll. She looked at the barn. She was, oh God, she was playing. She loved the loft. A scream tore from her throat. A sound that cut through the roar of the fire. "Lily! My baby! She's in the loft! Lily!" The entire yard froze. The bucket brigade stopped. Everyone stared at the barn. The loft. The hayloft. It was the very heart of the fire. Mr. Abernathy let go of the horse and lunged toward the burning entrance. "Lily!" Sheriff Blevins and 2 other men had to physically tackle him, wrestling him to the ground. "It's too late, man!" Blevins yelled, his voice cracking. "It's a tomb! You can't! She's gone!" But Elias was no longer there. While every eye was on the struggling, screaming Mr. Abernathy, Elias was moving. Clara saw him. He sprinted to the horse trough, where the water was black with ash. He grabbed a heavy wool horse blanket, soaked it, and in one fluid motion, threw it over his head. Clara understood. Her mind flashed to a kitchen table, to a story of a burning house. A story of a child. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice a raw tear in the chaos. "No! Elias, don't!" He stopped, just for a second, at the mouth of the inferno. He looked back at her. It was not a look of fear or of courage. It was a look of terrible, unavoidable destiny. He knew what fire was. He knew what it was to be held, helpless, while a child was consumed. And he would not, he could not, let it happen again. He turned and plunged into the wall of flame. He was gone. The entire community stood, paralyzed. The shouting stopped. The only sounds were the fire's roar, Martha Abernathy's broken wails, and Clara's choked, repeating whispers. "No! No! No!" The wait was an eternity. 10 seconds. 30. A massive support beam inside the barn groaned, and then crashed, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the sky. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. He was gone. "God have mercy," Blevins whispered, taking off his hat. And then, a shape. A dark, smoking thing stumbled out of the inferno. It was Elias. He was on fire. The blanket was gone. His shirt was a tapestry of burning cinders. He took 2 steps into the yard and fell to his knees, his lungs seizing in a terrible, smoke-filled cough. But he was clutching a small, limp, soot-covered bundle. He didn't have the strength to stand. He crawled. He crawled 3 more feet, his hands searing on the hot ground, and he held the child out. "Ma'am," he gasped. Martha Abernathy, who had been frozen in prayer, scrambled to him on her hands and knees. She ripped the child from his grasp. The girl, Lily, was limp. For one terrible second, there was silence. Then, the child's lungs convulsed, and she let out a thin, terrified wail. She was alive. Martha clutched her daughter, sobbing, rocking back and forth. Elias, his task complete, collapsed face first into the dirt, the flames on his back still flickering. And the town was in a state of stunned, shamed silence. They had come to watch a fire. They had seen a miracle. They had watched the man they called property, the vagrant, the savage, walk into the one thing he feared most on earth, to save the child of the very man who had tried to buy him. Mr. Abernathy, his face a mask of tears and disbelief, walked forward as if in a trance. He stood over the collapsed, smoking form of Elias. But Clara was there first. She shoved through the frozen crowd, her face a storm of terror and love. "Elias!" She fell to her knees beside him, beating out the last of the flames on his back with her bare hands, not caring that she was burning herself. "Elias, look at me!" she cried, turning him over. He was a wreck. His face was black, his hair singed away, his hands and arms a raw, red map of burns. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that brought up black soot. He forced his eyes open, his gaze struggling to find her. He found her. The silence of the town was absolute. It was the sound of 100 hearts breaking. It was the sound of an entire, rotten to the core belief system shattering in a single, heroic, sacrificial instant. They saw their own hatred, and they saw the man it was aimed at. And the shame was a physical, crushing weight. Elias looked at Clara, and a small, pained breath escaped him. "The fire," he whispered, his voice ravaged. I couldn't let it." "Shh," Clara wept, cradling his head in her lap. "You're home. You're safe. I've got you. I've got you." The fire at the Abernathy farm burned itself out, but it had ignited something else in Providence Creek, a slow, agonizing fire of conscience. For 3 days, Elias lay in Jacob's bed. Not in the barn. In the house. Clara did not leave his side. She was his nurse, his guardian, his silent, watchful partner. She gently cleaned his burns, the raw, red welts on his back and arms a terrible testament to his journey through hell. She spoon-fed him broth. She sat in a chair by the bed while he slept, the shotgun resting against the wall, her silent promise that no more harm would ever come to this man. The town, for its part, was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a siege, but the quiet of shame. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. Clara answered it, her hand on the shotgun. It was Mr. Abernathy. He stood on her porch, his hat crushed in his hands, his eyes red-rimmed. He could not look at her. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his voice thick. I come to see him." "He's resting," Clara said, her voice cold. "Please," Abernathy begged, his voice breaking. I ain't slept. My wife, she just holds Lily and cries." He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a terrible, soul-deep shame. I bit on him, ma'am. I called him. I said." He couldn't finish. He just shook his head. Clara looked at this broken man, and the ice in her heart thawed, just a little. She opened the door wider. Abernathy walked into the house as if entering a church. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the bandaged man who had saved his world. Elias was awake, his eyes watching. Abernathy fell to his knees. Not with a crash, but a slow, weary collapse. I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words torn from him. "God forgive me, I am so sorry." Elias said nothing. He simply held the man's gaze, and in his eyes there was no anger. There was no pity. There was only a profound, weary understanding. The following Saturday was the barn raising. When Clara helped Elias into the wagon, he was still weak, his movements stiff and pained. His hands were wrapped in clean white bandages. "We don't have to go," she said softly. "Yes," Elias said, his voice still rough from the smoke. "We do." As they pulled into the Abernathy yard, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. It was the same hush that had fallen at the auction, but this time, it was not born of hate. It was born of awe. Mr. Abernathy dropped the hammer he was holding and strode forward before they had even stopped. He did not speak to Clara. He went straight to Elias's side of the wagon. We can't get the main beam set right," Abernathy said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. It was not a statement. It was a plea. None of us, we don't have the skill. Elias, would you show us how?" It was a public abdication. An admission. It was the farmer, the landowner, asking the vagrant for his knowledge. It was an apology, made not in words but in the currency of respect. Elias looked at the gathered men. He saw their faces turned up to him. He saw Sheriff Blevins. He saw the farmers who had laughed. And he saw in their eyes a new, fragile, and desperate hope. He nodded. "I will help." And the work began. Elias, his hands still bandaged, could not lift. But he could lead. He stood at the center of the construction, his quiet voice directing the men. "No, shift it left. That joint needs to be braced, Sheriff. Lift together, now." And the men who had once called him property obeyed. They listened. They learned. They worked alongside him, not as a master and his lessers, but as a crew, united by the simple, honest act of building something new from the ashes. Clara watched, tears blurring her vision, as she worked with the women, preparing the great meal. She saw Dale Morrison, sitting on his horse on the distant hill, watching, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. He was alone. The power he had held over these people, the power of their shared hatred, had been burned away in the fire. At midday, Martha Abernathy called for the meal. The men, sweating and satisfied, formed a long line. Martha came out of her house, carrying the first, heavily laden plate. She did not go to her husband. She did not go to the sheriff. She walked past the entire line of hungry men, her head held high. She walked right up to Elias, who was sitting on a stump, resting. She held the plate out to him. "Mr. Elias," she said, her voice clear and strong for all to hear. "Our honored guest eats first." Abernathy, at the front of the line, just nodded, his eyes shining. Before Elias could take the plate, little Lily, her face clean, her pigtails tied with a blue ribbon, ran up to him. She held out a single, wild sunflower. "This is for you," she said, her small voice piping. "My angel." Elias looked at the flower. He looked at the plate of food. He looked at the faces of the people of Providence Creek, looking at him not with hate, but with a deep and humbling reverence. He took the plate, and for the first time since Clara had known him, a true, slow smile spread across his face. The final shot of the day was of Elias, sitting at a long table, surrounded by the very people who had once scorned him. He was breaking bread. He had a seat at the table. That evening, the sun was a glorious, bleeding spectacle of orange and purple. Clara and Elias sat on their own porch, the porch he had mended. The ranch was quiet, but it was the quiet of peace. He flexed his bandaged hands. "They'll heal," he said softly. "I know," Clara said. She placed her hand over his, her own small burns a faint pink. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to emerge. The ranch, once a skeleton, was alive. The fences were strong. The barn was whole. The well gave water. "We'll need to plow the north field soon," Clara said, her voice full of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "Before the first frost." Elias looked at the house, bathed in the soft twilight. Jacob's house. "He built a good house," he said, a quiet tribute. Yes, Clara whispered. He did. Elias turned his hand over, and his bandaged fingers gently clasped hers. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw no more ghosts. She saw home. It's not just a house anymore, Clara, he said, his voice deep and sure. It's a home. She squeezed his hand, her heart so full she thought it might break. The ranch was healing, and so were they.
Thank you for experiencing this story from Black Lives Story. We believe in the power of narrative to heal, to teach, and to unite. If you were moved by the story of Clara and Elias, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that need to be told. Let us know in the comments, what part of their journey touched you the most? Your support helps us keep these vital stories alive.